if you wanna rock and roll. It's a long way to the park if you wanna take a stroll. Every once in a while, just every once in a blue moon, for like 15 seconds, I feel like I get AC/DC. What it is, you have to get in that mindset of a guy that just busted his ass for 10 hours straight working at the steel mill. You have to get in that mindset where you're just kind of like sick of everything and you just want to go have a beer. You just want to go blow off some steam, put your feet up, and hear some like loud music. As you guys might remember, I grew up in the Rust Belt. In fact, my house growing up was right next to a rusted out steel mill that was so like contaminated that you weren't allowed, like nobody was allowed to go on that property. So like every once in a while, I kind of get it. Just every once in a while, you don't want something sophisticated. You don't even want to think. You just want to hear something loud and rowdy. To tie it into yesterday's episode, AC/DC is the band for people who say that's about the size of it. One thing that I do kind of like about American culture, I mean, there's a lot of things. I'm an American, but we do kind of like an underdog. Like, as somebody who kind of does have a legitimate claim to growing up kind of rough, kind of in a hard scrabble background, like I kind of am that. It's kind of funny because of course growing up, we never like sat around telling ourselves we're working class. We didn't really think of ourselves in terms like that at all. But it's kind of like when I moved to a big city, and especially when I moved to Austin, it's like a lot of those people are hipsters that are like rich kids that are like LARPing as working class people. Like obviously the whole hipster aesthetic is like we shop at thrift stores and we're like one of the common people. It's like they're fetishizing being broke or something, or just having old things. Like obviously hipsters love stuff like vintage refrigerators and anything that's sort of old. But it's like the reason we had stuff like that is because we were broke. Like I remember my cousin had this like vintage bicycle, or it was like a bicycle from the 60s or 70s or something. And I think the reason they had that bicycle is because it was just an old bicycle somebody had. I mean, it was cool looking and we liked it, of course, but I think they literally just got it because it was like a leftover, it was a hand-me-down bicycle from somebody. But when I think about that bicycle, it's like, yeah, that's something a hipster would pay hundreds of dollars for. So yeah, I mean, it's kind of refreshing to be in a small town and not live in that environment, but it is just, it's a little weird. It's like a bunch of people appropriating your culture. Growing up, we all wanted like new, nice things. We weren't trying to be that way on purpose. That's just how it was. Huh, look at that. Nothing in it. So yeah, in one way it's like almost kind of weirdly insulting, but in another way it's like almost a huge compliment. Like I authentically am what they try to seem like. Not to just go on and on about this, but another thing that occurred to me is like even the vinyl records thing. Like I had vinyl records as a kid, but it's because like at the antique store back in the day, a record was $1, whereas a CD was like $5 or $10. You know, like when I was 8, 10, 12 years old, somewhere in there, people weren't fetishizing vinyl in the same way. I mean, DJs and stuff did, I guess. But it wasn't like a cool thing to collect vinyl in the same way that it is now. Like we had records because we were broke, okay? We weren't trying to be cool. You know, even stuff like listening to obscure bands, people think of that as a pure hipster invention, and maybe it sort of is. But like one of the reasons I listen to a lot of obscure bands is because like at the place where I'd buy these records for $1, at some point you've got all the big records, but you're wanting to discover new music. So then it's like, well, I guess we'll start buying the weird stuff. Like, what's this thing with the spaceship on the cover? Let's listen to that. You know, there's only so many vinyl albums at Treasure Mart. So you might as well check out some of the weird ones. They're only $1, so screw it. And that's like actually how I discovered some great bands, like the band Renaissance. I think they're the best symphonic rock band of all time. But I literally bought that album because the cover was cool. Like, that's it. There are other ones like the band Accept, which is this German heavy metal band from the 80s. They did Balls to the Wall, and they have a really good song called Midnight Mover. Yeah, Midnight Mover. That's a good one to check out. But I just bought their album because the cover looked weird, and I just wanted to see what kind of band that was. So yeah, and I kind of never thought about it before, but it almost feels like hipsters were sort of appropriating that. It's like, oh yeah, well, there's only so many records here, let's just listen to all of them. Sometimes I kind of think some of this class antagonism is just a really, really, really bad thing. I actually don't think very much in terms of class, and I think a lot of that is just BS. Mainly because people that are really pro-working class or populist tend to let the average person off the hook morally. But then you have elitism, which does the opposite. It's like, oh, well, we have to just listen to the elites and they can do no wrong in this stuff. And then like all the blame is explicitly or implicitly put on like average people, basically. You know, the real answer is moral rules apply to everybody. If they're in power, if they're common people, it doesn't really matter. Like all of that class stuff just tends to be poisonous and stupid. But one thing I kind of will say about it, as somebody who has a very authentic working class background, but kind of has one foot in some sense in the intelligentsia, the intellectual side of things, it's like intellectuals and elites need to not just demonize the average person. This is clearly one of the big messages of nowadays. I'm not even saying this in like a political way, even though that's obviously a big thing that's happening. It's like, it really is true that society without people working those practical everyday jobs, like we can't just have a bunch of postmodernists like playing patty cake. Somebody has to build the houses, somebody has to do the welding, somebody has to work on your AC unit. But I will say something that's pretty unpopular to say nowadays is we do need intellectuals. Like obviously all the stuff people say about like the intellectual class being out of touch and like I kind of alluded to, sort of demonizing average people in implicit or explicit ways. Like clearly all that stuff is bad, but let's not forget that when it came to like universities, like the big famous universities or just intellectuals in general, in our past, some amazing things came from that world. Basically what I'm trying to say is we need intellectuals. We just need intellectuals who aren't out to lunch and ridiculous. We need a dynamic where the average person and the intellectual class respect each other, and for both of them to deserve respect. You know, like maybe intellectuals, instead of figuring out 50 new ways to inject postmodernism into anything, maybe they could kind of put some of that intellect to things that are actually going to help. And maybe for people like me that are kind of working class, it's like recognize that there's a great history there, and what we need to do is not eliminate that. We just need to restore it. Yeah, I guess this was a weird tangent, but basically we need reconciliation. We don't need one side to beat the other. We need a restoration of respect for the different roles we all have, and recognizing that you need the small stuff, you need the large stuff, you need the big ideas, the everyday things. It's all parts of one interesting mechanism. Okay, rant over. If you wanna rock and roll.